I thought losing everything would be the worst thing that could ever happen to me. I was wrong. The worst thing was being found by the one man I could never escape. The rain hit the pavement in sharp, cold needles, soaking through the thin fabric of my coat as I curled tighter against the brick wall behind me, trying to disappear into it, trying to become something no one would notice, something no one would take from again. But the city never let you disappear completely, not when you had nothing left to hide behind, not when your past still breathed somewhere out there in the dark, waiting to catch up. My fingers trembled as I pulled them deeper into my sleeves, the chills settling into my bones in a way that felt permanent, like it had claimed me, like I belonged to the cold now, just another forgotten piece of the city that kept moving no matter who it left behind. I used to have a home. I used to have a name that meant something. I used to stand beside a man who wore expensive suits and spoke in quiet commands that made rooms fall silent. But that life felt like it belonged to someone else now, someone I barely recognized when I tried to remember her face. A car slowed near the curb, its engine low and controlled, the kind of sound that didn't belong in places like this, and I felt it before I saw it. That shift in the air, that subtle pressure that made every instinct inside me go still. I kept my head down, hoping, praying it would pass, that whoever sat behind those tinted windows wouldn't see me, wouldn't look twice at the woman curled up on the sidewalk like she had nowhere else to go, because I didn't. The door opened. Slow, deliberate. Shoes met the pavement, polished, untouched by the dirt that clung to everything around me. And I knew before I looked up, I knew in the way your body remembers danger long before your mind catches up. My breath caught as I lifted my eyes, just enough to see him, tall, composed, wrapped in a dark coat that looked like it had never known a storm, his gaze already fixed on me like he had been searching, like he had already found exactly what he came for. Adrian Moretti didn't belong in my world anymore, and I definitely didn't belong in his. But there he was, standing 3 feet away like the past had decided it wasn't finished with me yet. For a second, neither of us spoke, the rain filling the silence between us, loud and relentless, until his eyes moved over me slowly, taking in everything I had tried so hard to hide, the truth I couldn't outrun. I expected anger, judgment, maybe even disgust, but what I saw instead made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't explain. Something unreadable. Something dangerous in a different way. Clara, he said quietly, my name sounding unfamiliar in his voice after all this time, like it didn't belong to me anymore. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet his gaze fully now, even though every part of me screamed to look away, to run, to vanish before he could pull me back into a world that had already taken too much. You shouldn't be here, I whispered, my voice barely steady, barely mine. His expression didn't change. Not even slightly. Neither should you, he replied. And then, after a pause that felt heavier than the rain itself, he added, get up. I didn't move. I couldn't. Because something in the way he said it told me this wasn't a suggestion. It never was with him. And deep down, in the part of me I wished was already gone, I knew this moment wasn't the end of my fall. It was the beginning of something worse. Or maybe, something I wasn't ready to survive. I stared at him, waiting for the moment he would change his mind, for the second where his expression would harden and he would walk away like everyone else eventually did. But Adrian Moretti did not move, did not blink, did not give me anything except that quiet, unshakable command that seemed to press against my chest harder than the cold ever could. The rain kept falling, sliding down his coat without leaving a mark, while mine clung to me like a reminder of everything I had lost, and for a brief second I hated him for it. For standing there untouched, while I was barely holding myself together. I said get up, he repeated, his voice still calm, still controlled. But this time there was something underneath it, something that did not allow refusal. My fingers tightened against the damp fabric at my sides as I slowly pushed myself up, my legs unsteady from hours of sitting on concrete, from days of not eating enough, from months of trying to survive without being seen. The world tilted slightly, and I caught myself against the wall, refusing to fall in front of him, refusing to look weaker than I already felt. His eyes followed every movement, not with pity, not with judgment, but with a kind of focus that made my pulse quicken in a way I did not trust. Why are you here? He asked, and the question landed heavier than anything else he could have said, because there was no simple answer to that. No version of the truth that did not sound like failure. I let out a breath that shook more than I wanted it to. I could ask you the same thing, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, trying to build some kind of distance between us even though he stood only a few feet away. One corner of his mouth moved slightly, not quite a smile, more like recognition. I was not the one sleeping on the street, he replied, and there it was, the edge I had been expecting, sharp but precise, not meant to wound but impossible to ignore. I looked away for a moment, my gaze dropping to the pavement where rainwater pooled around my worn shoes, because meeting his eyes felt like stepping back into a life I had already buried. You should leave, I said quietly. There is nothing here for you. The silence that followed stretched just long enough to make me regret speaking at all. Then I heard it, the subtle shift as he stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his presence cutting through the cold air. You are wrong, he said, and when I looked up again, there was something different in his expression now, something more personal, something that made my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fear. You have been something of mine for a long time, Clara, whether you realized it or not. My breath caught, the words settling into me slowly, dangerously, because they did not sound like ownership, not exactly, but they did not sound like coincidence either. I was married to your brother, I said, forcing the reminder into the space between us like a shield, like something that could push him back where he belonged. That ended the day he died. His jaw tightened, just slightly, the first crack in his perfect control. Nothing about that day ended, he said, quieter now, and for a moment the rain seemed to fade behind the weight of his words. I felt it then, the shift in the air, the same one from earlier but stronger now, pulling something buried up to the surface, something I had tried not to think about for a long time. You should not be digging into that, I warned, my voice lower, more serious than before, because this was not just about me anymore, not just about where I had ended up. This was about everything that had gone wrong long before tonight. Adrian studied me carefully, like he was measuring the truth in every word I spoke, and then he exhaled slowly, making a decision I could almost see forming in his mind. Get in the car, he said again. But this time it was different, less like an order and more like a line being drawn, something final. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to refuse, to run, to disappear before he could pull me back into the world that had destroyed everything I once believed in. But the truth settled heavy in my chest as I stood there in the rain, with nowhere else to go and no one else coming. This was not about choice anymore. It never had been. And somehow, I knew the moment I stepped into that car, whatever was left of the life I had been trying to rebuild would be gone for good. The door opened before I could change my mind, before I could convince myself to turn around and walk back into the rain, where at least I understood the rules, where survival was simple and expectations were low. But this was different. This was stepping back into a world I had once belonged to and had no idea how to survive anymore. I hesitated at the edge of the car, my reflection faint in the dark glass, barely recognizable, like a ghost of someone who had made better choices once, and for a second I wondered if he saw that too, or if all he saw was the woman who had failed his brother. Clara, he said quietly, not impatient, not forceful, just certain, and somehow that certainty pushed me forward more than any command could have. I slid into the seat, the leather cold but clean, the faint scent of something expensive and controlled filling the space, so different from the damp concrete I had been sitting on minutes ago that it almost felt unreal. The door closed behind me with a soft, final sound, like something sealing shut, and I felt it in my chest, that shift from outside to inside, from nothing to something I could not yet name. Adrian got in on the other side, the movement smooth, deliberate, like everything he did had already been decided long before it happened, and for a moment neither of us spoke as the car pulled away from the curb, the city lights blurring against the rain-streaked windows. I kept my hands in my lap, fingers curled together to keep them from shaking, my eyes fixed on the passing streets, because looking at him felt like inviting questions I was not ready to answer. You look thinner, he said after a while, his voice cutting through the quiet in a way that made my breath catch, because it was not an accusation, not exactly, but it was not neutral either. I let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but without any humor. That tends to happen when life does not go as planned. I replied, my tone sharper than I intended, but I did not take it back. He did not react immediately, which somehow made it worse, like he was choosing his response carefully instead of reacting on instinct. "You disappeared," he said finally. "After the funeral. No explanation. No trace." I swallowed, the memory hitting harder than I expected, the sound of rain that day, the weight of eyes watching me, judging me, blaming me without saying it out loud. "There was nothing left for me there," I said, keeping my voice low, steady, even though the truth underneath it was anything but. "Your family made that very clear." The air in the car shifted, subtle but undeniable, and I felt his attention turn fully toward me now, not just observing but focusing in a way that made it impossible to ignore him any longer. "My family," he repeated, quieter, like the words meant something different to him now than they used to. I finally looked at him, really looked, and for the first time since he found me, I saw it. Not just control, not just power, but something else beneath it, something fractured in a way that mirrored parts of myself I tried not to acknowledge. "You think I do not know that?" he continued, his voice still calm, but carrying something heavier now. "You think I have not questioned what happened?" My chest tightened, because that was the line I had been hoping he would never cross, the one place where everything became complicated, dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with the streets or the cold. "You should stop," I said quickly, my fingers tightening together again, my pulse picking up despite myself. "You will not like what you find." The car slowed as it turned onto a quieter street, the noise of the city fading just enough to make the silence between us louder, more defined. Adrian watched me for a long moment, like he was weighing something I could not see, and then he leaned back slightly, his gaze shifting forward again but not losing its intensity. "That is not your decision to make," he said, and there was no anger in it, no threat, just a certainty that felt more final than anything else he had said so far. I looked away, back out the window, but the reflection staring back at me was not the same one from before, not the woman trying to disappear into the background, but someone pulled back into a story that had never really ended, no matter how far she had run. And as the car moved deeper into a part of the city I had once called home, I realized something that made my chest feel tight in a completely different way. This was not just about being found. This was about everything that had been left unfinished. And Adrian Moretti was not the kind of man who walked away from unfinished things. The car came to a slow, almost silent stop, and I felt it before I saw it. That shift in atmosphere, the kind that told you had crossed an invisible line into somewhere you did not belong anymore, or maybe somewhere you once did and no longer had the right to claim. I looked out the window, my breath catching slightly as the gates opened ahead of us, tall, iron, familiar in a way that made something deep in my chest ache with a memory I had tried to bury. I had been here before, not as I was now, not broken and worn down by everything life had taken from me, but as someone who had walked through those gates with purpose, with a name that meant something, with a future that had not yet fallen apart. The car rolled forward, smooth and controlled, the gravel driveway stretching out beneath us, lined with soft lights that cut through the rain like quiet reminders of a life I had once touched but could not hold on to. I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening slightly against my coat as the house came into view, large, elegant, unchanged, like time had simply decided to leave it alone while everything else around it shifted and collapsed. "You remember," Adrian said quietly, not asking, just stating something he already knew, and I did not trust my voice enough to answer right away. Of course I remembered. Every corner of this place held something, a glance, a word, a moment that had once felt permanent and now felt like a story I had no right to revisit. The car stopped completely, and for a second, neither of us moved. The rain tapped softly against the roof, steady, almost patient, like it was waiting to see what I would do next. "I should not be here," I said finally, my voice low but firm, because that truth mattered, even if everything else felt uncertain. Adrian turned his head slightly, just enough for me to catch the edge of his expression, calm but unyielding in a way that made arguing feel almost pointless. "You already are," he replied, and there was no force in it, no raised tone, just a quiet certainty that made it impossible to ignore. The door opened again, not by me this time, and the cool air slipped in as I hesitated, my body caught between instinct and reality, between running and staying, between who I had been and who I had become. I stepped out slowly, my shoes pressing against the clean stone beneath me, and the contrast alone made my chest tighten, because it reminded me just how far I had fallen from this world. The front doors opened before we even reached them, and I stopped for a fraction of a second, my breath catching as I crossed the threshold, because something about it felt final, like stepping into a place that would not let me leave the same way I came in. Warmth surrounded me immediately, soft lighting, polished floors, everything exactly as I remembered, and yet completely different at the same time, because I was not the same person walking through it anymore. I stood there, unsure of what to do with my hands, my thoughts, myself, until Adrian moved past me, his presence shifting the space in a way that made everything feel more defined, more controlled. "You will stay here," he said, not loudly, not harshly, but with a tone that left no room for misunderstanding. I turned toward him quickly, the words hitting harder than I expected. "That is not your decision to make," I replied, even though part of me already knew how this would go, already knew that this was not a negotiation in the way I wanted it to be. His gaze settled on me fully now, steady, unwavering, and for a moment the room seemed to narrow down to just the two of us, everything else fading into the background. "You have nowhere else to go," he said, and it was not cruel, not meant to hurt, but it still landed with the weight of truth I could not deny. I opened my mouth to argue, to push back, to reclaim some piece of control, but nothing came out, because he was right, and we both knew it. The silence stretched, heavy and quiet, until he stepped a little closer, not invading, not threatening, just close enough that I could not pretend he was not there. "This is not about control," he added, his voice lower now, more measured, like he was choosing every word carefully. "It is about answers." My chest tightened at that, because that was the part one had been trying to avoid, the part one knew would come the moment he found me. I looked away, my gaze drifting toward the staircase, toward the familiar lines of a house that held too many memories, too many questions that had never been asked out loud. "Some answers come with consequences," I said quietly, more to myself than to him. But he heard it anyway. Of course he did. Adrian did not miss things like that. "So does silence," he replied, and that was the moment I realized something I had not fully accepted until now. This was not just about giving me a place to stay. This was not just about the past. This was about uncovering something neither of us was ready to face. And standing there, in a house that had once felt like safety, I understood that whatever came next would change everything again. I stood there longer than I should have, caught between the warmth of the room and the cold still clinging to my skin, unsure which one I deserved more, because comfort felt unfamiliar now, almost undeserved, like something that belonged to a version of me that no longer existed. Adrian had already moved away, his presence shifting deeper into the house, as if this place naturally responded to him, as if everything here understood its place in relation to him, while I remained near the entrance like I did not quite fit into the picture anymore. A woman approached quietly from the hallway, her steps measured, her expression neutral but not unkind, and for a moment I did not recognize her until something in her posture triggered a memory. "Clara," she said softly, her voice carrying a hint of familiarity that made my chest tighten unexpectedly. "It has been a long time." I blinked, trying to place her, and then it came back, small moments from years ago, glimpses of her moving through this house like part of its foundation. "Maria," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended, because saying her name felt like acknowledging how much time had passed, how much had changed. She gave a slight nod, her eyes scanning me briefly, not in judgment, but in quiet understanding, and somehow that was harder to face. "You must be cold," she said, already turning slightly as if the next step had been decided for me. "Come, I will prepare a room." I hesitated, instinct pushing against the idea of being settled into this place like I belonged here again, like nothing had happened, like I had not spent nights wondering how everything fell apart so completely. "I will not stay long," I said quickly, more for myself than for her. But Maria only paused for a moment before looking back at me with a calm that felt almost reassuring. "That is not always something we decide," she replied gently, and then continued walking, leaving me with the choice to follow or stand alone in a house that no longer felt like mine. I followed. Of course I did, because standing still felt worse somehow, like refusing movement would trap me in a moment I could not survive. The hallway stretched out ahead, familiar yet distant. Each step echoing softly beneath my feet as memories surfaced without permission, fragments of laughter, quiet conversations, a life that had once felt stable until it shattered in ways I never fully understood. Maria opened a door and stepped aside, revealing a room that looked untouched by time, clean, warm, carefully arranged, and I felt that same tightness in my chest again because it was too easy to imagine myself here, too easy to slip back into something that had already proven it could disappear overnight. "There are fresh clothes in the closet," she said, her voice steady, practical, "and a bath has been prepared." I glanced toward the doorway, half expecting Adrian to appear again, to remind me that none of this was without reason, that every comfort came with a question attached. But the hallway remained empty, quiet, leaving me alone with a space that felt both safe and unfamiliar at the same time. "Thank you," I said softly, and Maria gave a small nod before stepping away, closing the door behind her with a gentle click that echoed more than it should have. I stood in the middle of the room for a long moment, unsure what to do with the silence, with the absence of urgency that had defined my life for so long. Slowly, I moved toward the window, looking out at the rain that still fell beyond the glass, the world outside blurred and distant, like something I had already left behind even if I had not meant to. My reflection stared back at me faintly, cleaner now in this light, but still carrying the same exhaustion, the same questions that had not gone away just because the environment had changed. I let out a quiet breath, pressing my hand lightly against the cool glass, grounding myself in something real, something steady, because everything else felt uncertain. Adrian had said this was about answers, and I knew what that meant, knew what he would eventually ask, what he would expect from me, and the thought alone made my chest tighten again in a way that had nothing to do with fear of him and everything to do with the truth I had been running from. I closed my eyes for a second, just one, but it was enough to bring everything rushing back. The night everything changed, the words that were never meant to be spoken, the silence that followed. When I opened them again, I knew one thing for certain. Being here was not just a coincidence. It was a beginning. And this time, there would be no walking away before the truth came out. The warmth of the water should have relaxed me, should have washed away the weight of the past few months. But instead it only made everything sharper, clearer, like my body was remembering what it felt like to be taken care of and rejecting it at the same time, unsure if it was safe to accept something so simple again. I stood under the steady stream longer than necessary, letting it run over my shoulders, over the tension that refused to leave, over the memories that clung just as stubbornly. And when I finally stepped out, wrapping myself in a clean towel that felt too soft, too foreign, I realized something I had not allowed myself to think before. This place had not forgotten me. Every detail, every small comfort, it was all too easy, too intentional, like someone had decided I would need it before I even stepped through the door. I dressed slowly in the clothes Maria had left, simple but fitted perfectly, as if they had been chosen with care, and that thought unsettled me more than anything else. When I finally opened the door, the hallway was quiet, the kind of quiet that did not feel empty but waiting, like the house itself was holding its breath. I stepped out, my footsteps softer now, more controlled, but my mind was anything but steady, because I knew what was coming next. Adrian would not let this go. He never did. I found him in the study without needing directions, like some part of me still remembered exactly where he would be, the door slightly open, light spilling into the hallway in a narrow line that felt like an invitation, and a warning at the same time. I paused just outside, my hand hovering near the doorframe, my pulse picking up in a way that had nothing to do with fear of him and everything to do with what this conversation would bring. Then I pushed the door open. He was standing near the window, his back to me, one hand resting loosely at his side, the other holding a glass he had not touched, his posture calm but not relaxed, like even in stillness he was always aware, always calculating. "You took your time," he said without turning, his voice low, steady, and somehow that made it harder, because it meant he had known I would come, that this moment had been inevitable the second I stepped into this house. "I needed to think," I replied, closing the door behind me, the soft click echoing louder than it should have. He turned then, slowly, his gaze settling on me in a way that felt different now, sharper, more focused, like whatever distance had existed between us before was gone. Good, he said simply. Because so did I. The room felt smaller suddenly, the space between us charged with everything we had not said yet, everything that had been building since the moment he found me on the street. I crossed my arms lightly, not as a defense, but as something to ground myself, something to hold on to while everything else threatened to shift. Ask, I said quietly, because there was no point in pretending this was anything else. His eyes held mine for a long moment, searching, measuring, and then he took a slow breath, setting the glass down without looking at it, like his attention had narrowed down to only one thing. Why was my brother calling your name before he died? The question landed exactly where I knew it would, deep, unavoidable, cutting through everything I had tried to keep buried, and for a second I could not breathe, could not move, because hearing it out loud made it real in a way I had not prepared for. I looked away first, my gaze dropping to the floor, to the polished wood that reflected nothing back at me, because facing him in that moment felt impossible. You already think you know the answer, I said, my voice quieter now, the edge gone, replaced by something heavier, something closer to truth. If I did, he replied, his tone steady but carrying a weight I had not heard before, you would not be here. That made me look at him again, really look, and what I saw was not just suspicion, not just anger, but something else entirely, something that made my chest tighten in a way I did not expect. Doubt. And underneath it, something even more dangerous. Hope. I shook my head slightly, the motion small but firm, because that was the one thing I could not allow. You are asking the wrong question, I said, my voice steadier now, even as everything inside me felt like it was shifting. His expression did not change, but his focus sharpened, like he understood more than I had intended to reveal. Then tell me the right one, he said. I hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough to feel the weight of what I was about to say, enough to know that once it was out, there would be no taking it back. You should be asking who wanted him gone, I said finally, meeting his gaze fully now, because there was no point in hiding anymore. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, charged, filled with everything that sentence carried, everything it implied. Adrian did not move, did not react the way I expected, but I saw it in his eyes, that shift, that moment where everything he thought he knew began to crack. And in that moment, I realized something I had been trying not to admit since the beginning. This was not just his investigation anymore. It was ours. And the truth we were about to uncover would not leave either of us unchanged. The silence did not break right away. It stretched between us, heavy and deliberate, like the room itself was trying to understand what I had just said, and I could see it in Adrian's eyes. The exact moment when certainty turned into something far more dangerous, something that did not come with clear answers or clean lines. He did not speak immediately, and that alone told me everything, because a man like him always had something to say, always had control over the situation. But this was different. You are suggesting someone inside did this, he said finally, his voice low, measured, but there was something beneath it now, something sharper, more personal. I held his gaze, refusing to look away this time, because I had already crossed the line, already said what could not be unsaid. I am not suggesting, I replied quietly. I am telling you that the version of the truth you were given is incomplete. His jaw tightened slightly, the only outward sign that my words had landed exactly where I knew they would, and he turned away for a moment, pacing once across the room, slow, controlled, like he was reorganizing everything in his mind piece by piece. Then explain why you disappeared, he said without looking at me, his tone still even, but carrying an edge now that had not been there before. If you knew something like this, why did you walk away instead of coming to me? That question hit differently, not because I had not expected it, but because it carried something else with it, something I had not allowed myself to consider. Expectation. I let out a slow breath, my fingers tightening slightly against my arms as I searched for the right way to say it, the truth without everything that came with it. Because I did not know if I could trust you, I said finally, the words quieter than I intended, but steady enough to hold their weight. He stopped moving. Completely. The room seemed to narrow again, the distance between us suddenly more defined, more fragile, like one wrong step could break something neither of us fully understood yet. You think I had something to do with my brother's death, he said, not as a question, but as a realization, and hearing it out loud made something inside me twist in a way I had not prepared for. I did not know what to think, I admitted, because that was the only honest answer I had. Everything that happened, it did not make sense. People who should have spoken stayed silent. Things that should have been explained were buried. And you? I hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. You accepted it too easily. His eyes snapped back to mine at that, sharp, focused, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw something close to anger, not explosive, not uncontrolled, but contained in a way that made it more intense. You think I did not question it, he said, his voice still low but carrying more force now. You think I did not spend months trying to understand what happened. I shook my head slightly, not dismissing him, but holding on to my own truth. Then why did you stop? I asked, and that was the question that changed everything, because this time, he did not have an immediate answer. The silence returned, heavier now, more charged, and I watched as something shifted behind his eyes, something deeper than doubt, something that looked uncomfortably like realization. Because I was given answers, he said slowly, like he was hearing it himself for the first time. And I believed them. I let that settle, let the weight of it fill the space between us, because this was the moment everything started to align, the moment where the cracks became visible. Exactly, I said softly. You were given answers. That does not mean they were true. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair, the movement less controlled now, less calculated, and I could see it. The shift from certainty to something far more complicated, something that required him to question everything he had built his decisions on. Who? He said finally, turning back toward me fully, his gaze intense in a way that made it clear there was no turning back now. Who would have had the power to do this and make it look clean? I met his eyes without hesitation this time, because this was the part one had been carrying alone for too long. Someone close, I said. Someone trusted. Someone who knew exactly how your world works. The air seemed to tighten around us, the implications settling in slowly but undeniably, and I could see the moment it hit him, the moment where the list of possibilities became smaller, more specific, more dangerous. You have a name, he said, not asking, just stating what he already understood. I held his gaze for a long second, the weight of that name sitting heavy in my chest, because saying it out loud would change everything, would set something in motion that could not be undone. I have a suspicion, I replied carefully, because even now, I understood the line we were about to cross. Adrian stepped closer, not threatening, not aggressive, but focused in a way that made everything else fall away. Then we find out. If you are right, he said, his voice steady again, but different now, sharper, more intentional. And in that moment, I realized something that sent a quiet chill through me, not from fear, but from certainty. We were no longer looking at the past. We were walking straight into it. The moment he said it, something inside me shifted, not fear, not hesitation, but the quiet understanding that there was no going back now, no returning to the version of silence that had kept me safe, because safety had always been temporary, and truth had a way of finding you no matter how far you tried to run. Adrian moved first, not rushing, not reacting, but acting with that same controlled precision that defined everything about him, and I realized he had already stepped into this before I fully accepted it myself. We start with the people who were closest to him in the final weeks, he said, more to himself than to me, but his voice carried through the room with purpose. Already mapping out the next steps like this was something he could solve if he moved fast enough. I watched him, the way his posture shifted, the way his focus sharpened, and for the first time, I saw the difference between power and intention, because this was not about control anymore. This was personal. You are assuming they will still be where you left them, I said quietly, because nothing about this situation was that simple, nothing ever had been. He paused, just slightly, enough to acknowledge the truth in that, but not enough to slow him down. Then we find where they moved, he replied, his gaze flicking back to me, steady, unwavering. And we find out why. I stepped closer without realizing it, drawn into the gravity of what we were about to do, into the weight of something that felt inevitable in a way I could not explain. You think they will just tell you? I asked, not challenging, but grounding, because I knew this world, knew how carefully people guarded their secrets when they had something to lose. His expression did not change, but something in his eyes did, something colder, more resolved. They do not have to tell me, he said, and there was no threat in his tone, just certainty, the kind that made it clear he already had a plan, forming beyond what he was saying out loud. The room felt different now, smaller, more focused, like everything unnecessary had been stripped away, leaving only the path forward. I exhaled slowly, trying to steady the thoughts racing through my mind, because this was the moment I had feared and expected at the same time. There is something else, I said, my voice quieter, but it was enough to stop him, enough to bring his attention fully back to me again. The night he died, he was not alone before everything happened. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in concentration, like he was already connecting pieces I had not fully laid out yet. Who was with him? He asked, direct, focused, and this time I did not hesitate as long. I do not know for sure, I admitted, because that part had always been unclear, always just out of reach, but I remember a name being mentioned earlier that day. Not to me directly. I overheard it. The memory came back sharper than I wanted it to, voices low, urgent, a conversation that had not been meant for me, but it stayed with me anyway. Adrian stepped closer, not aggressively, but with a focus that made it impossible to ignore the importance of what I was about to say. What name? He asked, and I could hear it now, the shift in his voice, not just curiosity, but something deeper, something that understood this could change everything. I swallowed, the weight of it settling in my chest again, but this time I did not look away. Victor Hale, I said, the name leaving my lips slower than I expected, like it carried more than just sound, like it carried consequence. The silence that followed was immediate, heavy, and I saw it. The reaction he tried to hide, the way his expression tightened just enough to confirm what I had already suspected. He has been with us for years, Adrian said, more to himself now, his voice quieter, more controlled, but the shift was there, undeniable. Trusted, loyal. I shook my head slightly, not dismissing him, but grounding us both in the reality we were facing. That is what makes him the perfect choice, I replied softly. Adrian did not respond right away, and that silence told me everything I needed to know, because it meant he was seeing it. Now, not just hearing it, but understanding it in a way that could not be ignored. He turned away briefly, his hand brushing against the edge of the desk as he steadied himself, not physically, but mentally, like he was recalibrating everything he thought he knew. When he looked back at me, something had changed, something deeper than before, something that made my chest tighten in a completely different way. Then we start with him, he said, his voice firm again, but no longer untouched by doubt. And in that moment, I realized the truth was closer than either of us had expected, but so was the cost of uncovering it. The name did not leave the room quietly. It lingered, settling into the space between us like something that had been waiting to be acknowledged, and I could see it in Adrian's expression, the exact moment where recognition became something heavier, something personal in a way that could not be undone. He did not react the way most people would. There was no immediate anger, no visible shock, just that stillness that meant everything inside him had shifted into focus, into calculation, into something far more controlled than emotion. Victor Hale, he repeated slowly, like testing the weight of it, like confirming that it belonged in this conversation even if he did not want it to. I watched him carefully, because this was the moment that mattered, the point where he could choose denial, could choose to protect the version of reality that had kept everything stable, but he did not. Instead, he nodded once, small, deliberate, like he had already accepted that whatever came next would not be simple. He has been with my family longer than I have, Adrian said, his voice quieter now, not uncertain, but reflective, like he was looking back at something he had never thought to question before. He helped build everything we have. I let that settle for a second, because that was exactly why this mattered, exactly why it had gone unnoticed for so long. That is why no one would suspect him, I said softly, and why he would have the access to make everything look clean. Adrian's jaw tightened again, but this time it was different, not resistance, not disbelief, but acceptance mixed with something deeper, something that carried the weight of betrayal without needing to name it. He moved toward the desk, pulling open a drawer with measured precision, retrieving a file I had not noticed before, thick, organized, the kind of thing that suggested he had never fully stopped asking questions. even if he had convinced himself otherwise. "I never closed this," he said, almost to himself, placing it on the desk and opening it with a steady hand. I just stopped looking in the right direction. I stepped closer, drawn to the quiet gravity of the moment, to the way the pieces were starting to align in a way that felt both inevitable and unsettling. Papers spread across the surface, timelines, names, notes written in that same controlled handwriting that mirrored everything about him. And I could see it now, the gaps, the places where things did not quite connect, where assumptions had replaced answers. "You were close," I said, not to reassure him, but because it was true. "You just trusted the wrong silence." He glanced at me briefly, something softer flickering behind his eyes for a second, something that felt almost like acknowledgement before it was gone again, replaced by focus. "And you," he said, his tone shifting slightly, not accusatory, but intentional. "You carried this alone." I looked down at the file, at the evidence of questions that had never been fully answered, and for the first time, I did not feel the weight of it pressing me down the way it used to. "I did what I thought would keep me alive," I replied quietly. I did not realize it would keep the truth buried too. The room fell into a different kind of silence then, not heavy, not suffocating, but purposeful, like something had finally clicked into place between us, something that had been missing before. Adrian closed the file slowly, his fingers resting on the cover for a moment before he looked up at me again, and this time, there was no distance in his gaze, no barrier, just clarity. "You are not leaving," he said, and it was not an order, not this time, but a statement of fact, something that included me in what came next instead of placing me outside of it. I held his gaze, steady, because for the first time, I did not feel the need to run from it. "I was not planning to," I said, and the words surprised me as much as. They seemed to settle something in him. A small shift, almost imperceptible, but enough to change the space between us in a way that felt different, less like confrontation and more like alignment. He nodded once, like that was all he needed, like everything else would come with time. "Then we do this properly," he said, his voice firm again, but not cold, not distant. "No assumptions, no shortcuts. We find the truth, and we deal with it." I exhaled slowly, feeling something in my chest loosen for the first time in longer than I could remember, because this was not just about the past anymore, not just about what had been lost or hidden. This was about moving forward with something real, something that did not rely on silence or fear to hold it together. I glanced once more at the rain outside the window, softer now, lighter, like the storm had finally started to pass, and when I looked back at Adrian, I understood something I had not seen clearly before. He was not just a man who ruled his world. He was someone willing to change it when the truth demanded it. And somehow, without planning it, without meaning to, I had become part of that change. The past had brought us back together, but it was not what would define what came next. Because this time, we were not running from the truth. We were choosing it. And for the first time, that felt like something worth staying for.